In today's video, I will be creating a tier list of the 2024 Republican potential contenders for the presidency, and I will be ranking them from S tier to F tier about how electable these candidates are. So S tier obviously means they should run for president, and F tier means that they should not even consider it, and they're going to be very poor candidates for a general election. The first candidate here is Chris Christie. Now, Chris Christie is not well liked among the Republican Party, which is a problem. He probably has a higher approval rating among Democrats than Republicans, and he's not going to appeal to the Republican base here, and that's going to be a real problem for him in a general election. So I'm going to put him in a D tier. Now, Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump Jr. definitely not as experienced as Donald Trump in any means. He's just a substantially weaker version of Donald Trump. There's no, I don't think it should be fair. It would be fair to say that any of the sons or daughters of a president would necessarily be a strong presidential contender. I think he is a good example. He's probably not a strong presidential contender. Now, Trump. Trump is someone who is very well known. Obviously, he has that name recognition factor because he was the president of the United States for 4 years. He won in 2016 despite most pundits and polling suggesting that he would lose. He almost pulled up an upset again in 2020. Now, typically people don't run losing candidates, and that's going to be a problem for Donald Trump if he chooses to run that he lost in 2020. But Trump is very well liked among the Republicans, and he was able to get the most amount of votes as a Republican candidate ever in 2020. So I think that him being a former president, that should put him in the A tier. He should be a pretty strong candidate, and right now I think he's between S minus and A plus. I'm gonna put him as S because he was, after all, a former president and someone who was clearly favored in the GOP nomination field. Next is Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is someone who is also well recognized among voters. Now, definitely not as well recognized as Donald Trump, but still a pretty recognizable name. He is right now the second place contender for the Republican primary, up behind Donald Trump, though significantly behind Donald Trump. He should be someone who is relatively electable, though he has some pretty conservative stances and has moved for some pretty conservative bills in his own state that may hurt him with independent voters. Nonetheless, his name recognition should put him in S tier, as well as his current polling with the Republican primary if Trump decides not to run. So, Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott is a relatively conservative governor in the state of Texas. I don't know how well he'll perform in a general election. My assumption is that he's going to do better than someone like Donald Trump Jr. or Chris Christie, but not that well. So I'm going to put him in C tier. Ivanka Trump. Again, I think it would be disingenuous to say that she'll do that well in the presidential election. Again, my opinion is that uh, daughters and sons of influential figures, they don't necessarily make good candidates in themselves. Although they have the Trump name, I just don't think they're going to resonate well with voters. So I'm going to put her in C tier, slightly above Donald Trump Jr., but still not that well. Next is Larry Hogan. Now, Larry Hogan is someone who could do well in the presidential election because he could appeal to liberal voters. That being said, he's going to lose some of his conservative base, but he's not hated as a candidate like Chris Christie among the Republican base. And again, he was a governor of the state of Maryland. Obviously speaking, he can't be too conservative. I'm going to put him in B tier. Going to Mike Pence here. So Pence is someone who I don't think is personally very electable, but he was the vice president of the United States, which is still, I mean, he still has that name recognition compared to some of the other candidates. He he is someone who I'd say think would make an okay candidate, but not necessarily the best one. But I will put him in B tier because some of the other candidates are simply not recognizable people. Next is Mitt Romney. Now, Romney lost against Obama in 2012. He did better than John McCain in 2008, but that doesn't mean he's a very electable candidate. I personally think that he's not going to do all that well in a presidential election. He's not that well liked among the ultra conservative MAGA base. And those voters are necessary to gain high Republican turnout, right? He's not going to have those type of numbers. At the same time, he was a presidential election candidate, which means that he was able to win his own party's primary at least once in 2012. So I'm going to put him in B tier. Next is Nikki Haley. Now, Nikki Haley would be a relatively strong option, in my opinion, because she was the ambassador to the United Nations. She's someone who I think would have just right opinions about issues to be conservative enough to the Republican base, but not conservative enough for independents to not vote for her. Nonetheless, again, she's not, and she's rising in the GOP hypothetical polling, even with Trump on the ballot. The problem is she's still not going to win a primary, and I'll put her in A tier. Next is Rick Scott of the state of Florida, a one of the two Florida senators. Now, I don't think he is personally very electable. Again, voters, most of them probably don't know his name. And that's a problem for many of these candidates, especially the candidates I put at the back. These candidates, they're not people who are very recognizable, and that's going to be problems for all of them. I think Rick Scott is still fine, but he's just going to do in probably C tier. Now, next will be Paul Ryan, who was the former Speaker of the House. Now, I don't think he's going to do too well in the presidential election. He was the vice presidential nominee to Mitt Romney, who was mentioned here, who lost in 2012. Now, again, if you are picked as a vice presidential election candidate, that boosts your name recognition. But I don't think voters necessarily view too well of him, and I think that's going to be a problem for him in any potential general election. And I just don't think he's going to be able to appeal to voters that well. I'm going to put him in C tier. Now, Rand Paul of the state of Kentucky, not a particularly recognizable name to voters, someone who I think probably isn't conservative enough for today's MAGA base. Again, many of these candidates, if your name is not recognized by voters, people are not going to vote for you. And that's also going to be a problem for him. I'm going to put him in C tier. So next is Marco Rubio. Rubio came third in the Republican primary back in 2016. He was fighting against Donald Trump. I don't think personally that he's going to do too well as a presidential contender in 2024. In 2016, the circumstances were much more different, right? Where we did not see someone like Donald Trump being on the ballot. And Trump today is just a powerhouse for the Republican Party, and you cannot avoid him. Right? In 2016, I think he would have been a pretty strong candidate. He would have been an S tier or A tier, but not now. I think now, in today's day and age, he'll probably go in the B tier. Now going to someone like Ted Cruz. Again, Ted Cruz, a Tea Party candidate. I personally think that he would have done decently in 2016 if he would have won there in the Republican primary. He would probably be somewhere in A tier. The problem now, again, similar to Marco Rubio, his popularity is not very good, especially with the Cancun thing. That would probably hurt his name recognition, hurt his popularity, and taint his reputation, right? Also, he's not someone whose name is very commonly mentioned these days, and I think he'll probably go in B tier. Tom Cotton of the state of Arkansas. Again, these senators without much news coverage and people who are just very normal candidates, right? They're not particularly electable or unelectable. So I'm going to put him in C tier. Tucker Carlson. If you're a host who got kicked out off of Fox News, I just don't think you're someone who's, personally speaking, very electable for a presidency. There's a difference between a speaker and a news anchor than being the actual president. People are not going to vote for him, and I think he will be in D tier. John Kasich. John Kasich was someone who held out very long in the Republican presidential primary back in 2016, who was also fighting against Donald Trump. Now the problem with him is that He stuck out for a much longer time than Marco Rubio, who decided to drop out early, and he ended up with less delegates than him. Sure, he won his home state of Ohio, where Trump is now very well liked in, and he defeated Trump there and took all the delegates there. Sure, but I don't think he has any national appeal. He was a former Ohio governor, but that doesn't mean he's gonna win the presidency. Winning Ohio is much different from the presidential election. I'll put him in C tier. Tim Scott. So previously I would have said Tim Scott is an ideal candidate for the Republican Party. He is an African American, which might help with minority voters. He is a senator, and his views, I think, are just right for the Republican Party. He is not liberal enough or moderate enough for Republicans to dislike him, but he is also not extreme enough for independents to not vote for him. The problem again is that he is struggling, right, in the presidential election on the Republican primary side to actually engage voters to end up voting for him in a primary. And I just don't think he's going to make it to a general election. I'm still going to put him in A tier, but really he should be somewhere closer to B tier. Now, these candidates, I'm not going to talk about them because they are not recognizable people. Again, if I had to put them on, I would put all of them in F tier because again, if people haven't heard of you, you're not going to win any presidential election. Anyways, thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.